Hello students, our lesson for today is about the impacts of tourism and hospitality. Are you ready? Let's begin. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to determine the economic effects of tourism and hospitality, discuss the social impacts of tourism and hospitality, explain the impacts of tourism and hospitality on culture, and analyze the environmental impacts of tourism and hospitality. The rapid growth of tourism and hospitality in the 20th century has produced both problems and benefits for destination countries. It has had visible impacts on the socio-cultural and socio-economic environment. Although tourism and hospitality can bring economic advantages to a destination country, it also brings with it serious long-term problems which, without careful control and planning, can threaten the society. So let's first discuss the positive economic effects of tourism and hospitality. Like any other industry, tourism and hospitality affects the economic of those areas in which it takes place. The area affected may be a resort, a region, or the entire nation. Notwithstanding the size of the affected area, the economic effects of tourism and hospitality may be classified into four groups. These are effects on income, on employment, on the area's balance of payments with the outside world, and on investment and development. So first is the effects on income. The tourism and hospitality industry obviously generates income within a destination country. Nations wanting to increase their income have used tourism and hospitality as a means for reasonably quick development. Experience has shown us that it takes less time to increase income from tourism and hospitality than from manufactured goods or other available options. Tourism income in general comes from wages and salaries, interest, rent, and profits. Since tourism and hospitality is a labor-intensive industry, the greatest proportion of its income is derived from wages and salaries. Income is also generated from interest, rent, and profits on tourism and hospitality businesses, such as interests paid on loans to an airline in order to buy aircraft, or rent paid to a landowner for a car park. Income is also obtained from direct taxation or indirect taxation. Imposing value-added tax or VAT on hotel bills is an example of indirect taxation. Tourism and hospitality is both an income generator and an income redistributor. Most of the tourist receipts go to the developing nations of the world, such as in East Africa and the Pacific. Because of the flow of capital from one country to another, many countries limit the amount of currency the nationals may take abroad for foreign travel. Much of the income at the international and national level is business income, which is generated by organizations buying and selling goods and services to tourists. One advantage that tourism and hospitality offers developing countries is the range of businesses needed to provide to tourists. It includes local food, drinks, and flowers for the resort areas, local crafts for the tourists to buy, local cafes and restaurants, tour guides and interpreters, local travel services, local cultural events, shops for tourists' needs, and specialized local housing such as pensions and small inns. So the sum of all income in a country is called the national income. The importance of tourism and hospitality to a country's economy can be measured through the national income created by tourism and hospitality. The most common method for estimating the income generated from tourism and hospitality is by determining the multiplier for a destination. So multipliers are means of estimating how much extra income is produced in an economy as a result of the initial spending or injection of cash. Next is employment. So employment from local to national benefits as well from tourism and hospitality. In general, the tourist industry offers more employment opportunities than other economic sectors. Generating employment is perhaps the greatest advantage of tourism and hospitality on a developing economy. Tourism and hospitality generates employment faster for developing nations than for the developed ones. In general, tourism and hospitality employees in developed nations are usually paid less. In developing countries, the opposite is true. There are three types of employment generated by tourism and hospitality. These are the direct, indirect, and induced employment. So direct employment is generated as a result of providing goods and services directly to tourists in hotels, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, and the like. Indirect employment consists of those positions that are associated with other tourism-related activities but are used by both the local resident and the tourist. Shops and food wholesalers are considered to be sources of indirect employment. Induced employment refers to people working in positions only peripherally related to tourism and hospitality, but generated because of it. Examples are construction workers, merchants, and professionals such as doctors and accountants who service the employees working directly in tourism-related positions. Next is area's balance of payments with the outside world. Tourism and hospitality has a major influence on the country's balance of payments. Balance of payments is an accounting of flow of goods, services, and funds in and out of the country during a given period. If a country pays or agrees to pay more money than it receives, it has a deficit in its balance of payments. If it receives more money than it sends or exports, it has a surplus in its balance of payments. Most countries, particularly those with good tourism and hospitality facilities but little industrial or agricultural export potential, appreciate the contribution that incoming tourists can make to their balance of payments account. They therefore take steps to maximize their tourist receipts through the development of new attractions, promotions, subsidized exchange rates, and other measures. They also try to keep their own residents within the country by taxation on outgoing tourists, limitations on foreign exchange availability, or refusal to grant exit permits, as in many communist countries. Next is investment and development. So once an area has become economically successful, businessmen and government agencies may be influenced to invest in tourism and hospitality and other industries in that area. This is known by economists as an accelerator concept. So now let's move on to the negative economic aspects of tourism and hospitality. While most countries encourage tourism and hospitality for its economic benefits, there are some negative economic aspects of tourism and hospitality that have to be identified and discussed. These are high inflation and land speculation destination, high leakages from the economies of developing countries, low returns on investments because of seasonal fluctuations in demand, and overdependence on tourism and hospitality. So first is high inflation and land speculation destination. The inflationary effects of tourism and hospitality can arise in different ways. Rich tourists can afford to buy items at high prices. Retailers, realizing that their profits can be greatly increased by catering to tourists, increase their prices on certain products and provide more expensive goods and services. Such stores can compete more successfully with those catering to local residents. They can afford to pay higher rents and taxes, which are passed on to the customers through higher prices. Thus, local residents have to pay more for their goods. Inflation within destination areas is also caused by increasing land values. Growth in the tourist trade creates additional demand for land, and competition from potential buyers increases the price of land. The demand for more hotels, vacation homes, and tourist facilities may bring more income to builders, real estate agents, and landowners, but local residents are forced to pay more for their homes because of the increased value of land. Next is high leakages from the economies of developing countries. Leakage occurs from a variety of sources. It occurs from the cost of goods and services that must be imported to satisfy the needs of tourists. Examples of these are developing countries which have to import cars, buses, manufactured materials, and technology from developed nations to meet the demands of tourists. Another source of leakage is the remittance of profits and wages to outside sources. If foreign capital is invested in countries' tourism and hospitality industry, planned interest payments, rents, or profits may have to be paid to the foreign country, thereby reducing profits in the destination country. A third source of leakage is the expenditure for promotion and publicity to encourage tourists to visit a certain destination. The cost of advertisement is a large expense that reduces the earnings of a destination area. Next is low returns on investments because of seasonal fluctuations in demand. So many tourist regions experience low returns on investment because of seasonal fluctuations in demand. The seasonality of demand is reflected in hotel occupancy rates. Many hotels experience greatly reduced revenues during the off-season. Nevertheless, most hotels prefer to remain open all year round to secure as much revenue as possible. Accommodation investments are not the only ones with a low rate of return. Tour operators also face similar problems. Next is overdependence in tourism and hospitality. So some destinations have made themselves vulnerable to changes in tourist demand by becoming overdependent on tourism and hospitality for their livelihood. Tourism is highly susceptible to changes from within and outside the industry. Examples of changes from within are price and fashions, while global economic trends, political situations, and energy availability are examples of outside changes. Many tourists avoid destinations which are politically unstable, but they usually select an alternative. The decrease in demand for a destination results in underutilization of services, unemployment, and loss of income. So, there are a number of ways to maximize the benefits of tourism and hospitality to the destination area. According to Edward Inskip in 1991, a consultant for the United Nations World Tourism Organization, he suggested the following impact control measures. First is develop tourism and hospitality gradually so that local residents can have sufficient time to adapt to it and understand it. It would also allow the government to properly plan, organize, and monitor tourism and hospitality. Next is maintain a scale of tourism and hospitality development that is appropriate for the local as well as national environment. If possible, develop other economic sectors so that there is a balanced economy and employment structure. In some areas, small-scale and dispersed forms of tourism are more suitable than concentrated mass tourism development. The third one is involve residents and their spokesmen in planning and decision-making so that they can participate in determining the future of this sector. Fourth, apply the concepts of tourism development zones. Next, make certain that residents have easy access to tourist attractions, facilities, and services including reduced admission fee if necessary, and that important amenity features have public access and are not preempted by tourism. Next is provide incentives to local ownership, management, and operations of hotels and other tourist facilities and services so that residents can receive direct economic benefits. Next is develop strong linkages between tourism and hospitality and other economic activities such as agriculture, fisheries, handicrafts, and manufacturing to help develop these sectors, reduce leakage of foreign exchange through import substitution, and spread the economic benefits of tourism and hospitality. Next is plan, develop, and organize tourism and hospitality so that no area becomes too congested with tourists and residents can easily use community facilities and services. And lastly, train local people to work effectively in all levels of tourism and hospitality, including managerial and technical positions, to reduce the number of imported employees and to lessen possible misunderstandings between tourists and local employees. So now let's go to the social impacts of tourism and hospitality. The social impacts of tourism and hospitality should not be confused with the popular term social tourism. The social impacts of tourism and hospitality refer to the changes in the quality of life of residents of tourist destinations, while the objective of social tourism is to ensure that tourism is accessible to all people. So before we go to the effects of social impacts of tourism and hospitality, let us first discuss the host-visitor interactions. So tourism and hospitality causes more interaction between people, particularly between the tourists or visitors and the local residents or hosts. To understand the social impact tourists have on an area, the characteristics of various types of visitors and the level of interaction with the host should be clarified. According to Smith in 1997, he categorized tourists into several types and outlined her views in the intensity of interaction between the tourists and local residents. So her classifications are as follows. The first one is explorer. This type of visitor is interested in being an active participant observer among the population. The explorer easily adapts to local lifestyles and does not need special tourist accommodations. Next is elite. This type of tourist is few. He can afford to pay well for unusual vacations. He is well-traveled and usually known as the jet setter. He differs from the explorer in his attitude. His arrangements are either made by a travel agent or may be pre-planned. Although he is willing to sample the local lifestyle, he requires some degree of comfort. Next is offbeat. This tourist adapts well to simple accommodations and services provided for the occasional guest. Unusual tourists. These tourists love sub-exotic cultural sites, and the unusual or primitive sites as long as he can quickly and safely return to more familiar surroundings and groups. Next is incipient mass tourist. This is a visitor who looks for the amenities of Western societies in hotels and other travel-related facilities. He is a mixture of both pleasure seeker and business traveler. Next is mass tourist. He comes from the middle class. He arrives in a destination with other tourists. So there is a diversity of tastes among them, and their attitude is you get what you pay for. And lastly, charter tourists. The charter tourist comes en masse with others of his kind, creating an extremely high amount of business and receiving a high degree of standardization in services and products. The interaction between the visitors and the hosts is limited and impersonal. So the level of interaction between the hosts and guests is illustrated in this table for each type of tourist. The impact increases with each level of tourist. The explorers and elite tourists usually have little impact on the local culture because of their limited number. The offbeat and unusual tourists generally use the same hotels and services as the local travelers. With the increase in number and greater expectations and demand for special facilities and services, a corresponding change in the local area occurs. Against this background, it is possible to discuss the positive and negative social impacts of tourism and hospitality on a tourist destination. So let's move on to the positive social effects of tourism and hospitality. Some of these are: it creates a new medium for social change and multicultural understanding. It encourages adaptation to the realities of modern life and works toward improving the host country's environment and lifestyle options. It promotes knowledge and use of foreign languages, and it improves health conditions and disease control. So first is social change and multicultural understanding. One of the most important benefits of tourism and hospitality is the bringing together of diverse people to help them understand one another. Pope Pius XII touched on this aspect of tourism and hospitality when he spoke of subjecting oneself joyfully or sorrowfully to the inconveniences, great or small, which can with difficulty be avoided. The United Nations World Tourism Organization considers tourism as an encounter between a person and a destination in its natural setting. Above all, the UNWTO believes it is an exchange or encounter between individual groups of people as well as between social groups. Thus, it becomes an encounter between nations and an exchange of values. The impact of this exchange is significantly different between industrialized nations and developing agricultural nations. The more isolated the country visited, the more significant the social changes are likely to be. Next is adaptation to the realities of modern life and improvement of the host country's lifestyle. This positive social benefit is the result of the following. The quality of life improves in places where tourism and hospitality is being developed by bringing both the urban infrastructure like water, housing, and sewerage, and population benefits such as medical care, social assistance, and schools together. Next, the changes that occur in occupation and income patterns create a middle class with its different attitudes, values, and social concerns. Next is increased social mobility results in new employment opportunities in tourism and hospitality, and changes in family relations occur through the employment of women outside the home. This increases the family income and gives the workers' children more opportunity for higher education. Thus, tourism and hospitality promotes progress and modernization through exposure to other attitudes and values. It brings about improvements in facilities and services, as well as improvements in lifestyles and quality of life of the residents of the host country. Next is use of foreign language. So it brings people in contact with those of other language groups. The need and the desire to communicate increase interest in both the host and visitors to learn another language. Visitors to other destinations often want to learn a language to improve the quality of future experiences. They may rent tapes or buy books to assist them in learning a language. Many popular tourist destinations have developed short-term language courses to assist visitors. Next is improved health conditions and disease control. The desire of tourists for high-quality public health facilities can contribute to the maintenance and improvement of those facilities in destination areas and provide additional sources of revenue, which in turn can be invested in upgrading water and sewage disposal facilities. Through tourism and hospitality, local residents can become aware of both health problems and good hygiene. This awareness can lead to a change in the health infrastructure of a destination. Improvement in one community then paves the way for improvement of the whole region. So now let's go to the negative social effects of tourism and hospitality. While tourism and hospitality has enabled different people to strengthen the social structure, mass tourism has brought with it expenses and problems. Among these are social saturation. changes in the social structure, behavior, and roles, community problems, and negative demonstrative effects. First is social saturation. The presence of large numbers of tourists in particular places at specific times results in saturation or congestion of facilities and services and competition for limited resources. The local residents frequently resent having to share their facilities and services with visitors. In destinations that attract a large number of tourists, public transportation is so crowded with tourists that there is hardly any room for local residents. Shops are full of travelers, forcing the locals to change their shopping patterns. Streets are full of visitors, resulting to traffic jams. Thus, saturation or congestion brought about by tourism and hospitality is often cited as a social cost. Next is changes in social structure, behavior, and roles. Tourism and hospitality changes the traditional forms of employment, which results in the lowering of the status of agricultural workers, migration of the population, and the breaking up of families. Many young people demand freedom from their families. They also disregard social norms such as respect for elders and close family ties. Young women who enter the workforce have changed their traditional dress to tourist clothes. Tourism and hospitality in some areas lead to other social problems in the family. Some wives who work in tourism and hospitality establishments have higher salaries than their husbands. This often leads to the loss of self-confidence among their husbands, and in addition, their improved way of dressing and grooming causes their husbands to be jealous and suspicious. This has led to a higher divorce rate. This disruption in the kinship system reduces cohesiveness in the whole community, thus changing the population characteristics. Community problems. Prostitution, often called the oldest profession, certainly existed before the growth of mass tourism. It is difficult to say how responsible tourism and hospitality has been for the rise of prostitution in tourist destinations. There are several reasons for the increase of prostitution in tourist resorts. The first one is the processes of tourism and hospitality have created locations and environments which attract prostitutes and their clients. By its very nature, tourism and hospitality means that people are aware from the puritanical bonds of normal living, anonymity is assured away from home, and money is available to spend hedonistically. These circumstances are conducive to the survival and expansion of prostitution. As tourism and hospitality affords employment for women, it may upgrade their economic status. This in turn may lead to their liberalization and eventually to their involvement in prostitution to maintain or acquire new economic levels. And tourism and hospitality may be used as a scapegoat for the general loosening of morals. The use of erotic pictures and suggestive slogans in an advertisement leads some tourists to anticipate sun, sea, sand, and sex as part of their vacation experience. An increase in visitors increases criminal activity. Wealthy tourists present tempting targets. So here are some of the factors in the relationship between crime and tourism and hospitality. Population density during the tourist season increases, creating the availability of a large number of targets and congestion. The differences in income between hosts and tourists encourage robbery, and the proximity of resorts to an international border may attract undesirable migrants, resulting in increased expenditures for law enforcement and monetary losses for businesses that become targets. Next is the negative demonstrative effects. So, negative demonstrative effects consist of tourist behaviors which can be considered socially and economically inappropriate. One of the major results of negative demonstrative effects is the polarization of the hosts from the tourists, which happens in a number of ways. First, Tourists often demand commodities and facilities beyond the economic capacity of local residents. Rich tourists frequently eat in the fine restaurants and live in luxurious hotels in areas characterized by hunger, unemployment, and limited economic opportunity. This disparity has led, in some cases, to militant revolutionary action by the local residents. Second, the social norms of the tourists that are very different from the local customs give rise to social problems. Also, the values and materialism of young travelers are copied by the young local people. Examples are nude bathing, inappropriate manner of dressing, and irresponsible behavior. A third factor which initiates polarization is the importation of foreign workers from more developed countries. These workers who are more skilled than the local people generally get better paying jobs and are usually supervisors of the less skilled local people. These foreign workers also compete more favorably for goods and services than the locals. Thus, the locals begin to resent the foreigners. The opposite is true in the case of some of the developed countries where less skilled immigrants take lower paying jobs, thus forming a lower social and economic group. This association sometimes creates a social problem since the immigrants are not aware of the norms and standards of the host country. There are changes in the consumption patterns in some tourist areas. In some places, the importation of foreign foods has little impact on their life, while others, a considerable change has occurred. The people almost abandoned their local foods in favor of imported foods such as fast food from Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, and the like. So, a number of control measures can be adopted to decrease the negative change in an area. The first one is reducing the contact between host and guest by limiting the carrying capacity of the destination and by regulating the tourist flow. Second, separating the host and the tourist within tourist enclaves. Third, designing community education and citizen involvement programs centered on tourism and hospitality development, policy and regulatory issues. And fourth, expanding human resource development and training programs in all components of the tourism and hospitality system to include social skills like interpersonal relations and networking referral tactics. So now let's go to the impact of tourism and hospitality on culture. Tourism and hospitality increases the acculturation process as well as the cultural convergence of people. Acculturation is defined as those changes that occur in a culture through borrowing from other cultures. These changes may include technology, language, and values. Cultural convergence is the tendency of world cultures to become more alike. A very good example of this is the adaptation of many European ways by people of less developed countries because of their exposure to European culture and technology. The urban areas of the world are becoming more and more alike. Modernization and change from an agricultural society to an industrialized one bring about changes in people's attitudes, beliefs, and way of life. Part of this change occurs through contact with tourists. Tourism and hospitality is a vital force in acculturation since it causes more interaction between people. So people who change the list are the isolated ones, those who live in regions of extreme environmental conditions such as deserts, jungles, and polar regions. The two most important positive effects of tourism and hospitality on culture are the promotion of intercultural communication and the renaissance of native culture. The first one is intercultural communication. Mobility, which is a prerequisite of tourism and hospitality, is necessary for different social groups, nationalities, and cultures to meet and interact. Such interaction may contribute to the removal of social or national prejudices and the promotion of better understanding and positive social change. Cross-cultural communications between tourists and their host may promote changes in local culture while preserving or revitalizing local ethnic and cultural identity. The quality of cross-cultural communication is of prime importance if it contributes to the promotion of understanding between tourists and their hosts. Next is the renaissance of native culture. Tourism and hospitality may be important to the host country to remind its people of its history and culture. In Eastern and Western Europe, many traditional folk customs and costumes are preserved for the benefits of tourists. Folk culture festivals are organized to attract visitors. Model cultural centers in both developed and developing countries have been highly profitable and have helped maintain interest in their cultures. Traditional art forms have been revived in several countries. Tourism and hospitality has stimulated the preservation of traditional art, including traditional songs and dances. The establishment of the model cultural villages, or the living museums, has contributed largely to the renaissance of native traditions and crafts. Model culture villages create historical and ethnic environments designed to perpetuate tradition and stimulate awareness of the local area. There are two main purposes for cultural model villages. The first is to provide a location where visitors may observe and participate in a particular culture without disrupting the everyday life of the people who live in the area. The second is to portray the past history of the area. An example of a cultural model village is the Polynesian Cultural Center in Hawaii, which was designed to keep the traditional art forms and practices alive, giving the visitors a chance to view some limited historical aspects of lifestyle as it once was. As a cultural living or museum, the center concentrates on certain dynamic and tangible aspects of culture. In order to make the visit meaningful, each of the villages developed a specific activity such as husking a coconut, learning to play a percussion instrument, involvement in a game of skill, or performing a dance that encourages tourist participation. Some museums that are designed to display culture are Bangkok's Rose Garden, Tijan Orchid Island, and Alaska's Nana Museum of the Arctic. Here in the Philippines, especially here in Davao region, we also have one in the Crocodile Park in Davao, in which they have there a cultural village that they also have a folk dance and a fire dance, I think every Friday. Next is the negative cultural impact of tourism and hospitality. So while tourism and hospitality has enabled different people to restore and maintain interest in their own cultures, it has also led to the destruction of a country's work of art. The local residents resent tourists who think they have the right to the country's art, whether bought or stolen. Several tourists persuade the natives to sell traditional objects which have been used for generations. The greed for money, which induces people to part with family heirlooms, explains the destruction of the archaeological sites or the desecration of monuments in Egypt, Bali, India, or Central America. Moreover, the increasing demand for artifacts has led to changes in its form and functions as art objects. So, the artifacts may no longer be represented as traditional arts due to some reasons. First is mass production due to increase in demand result to losing the careful and precise product workmanship. Next is the impersonal nature of the tourist market has decreased the spiritual relevance of the artist's work. Art is produced according to the taste of tourists, which in Africa means carving animals, grotesqueness, and gigantism, and the increased demand has led to the misrepresentation of the age or authenticity of objects, resulting in a large number of limitations. Even model cultural villages may be encouraging the loss of culture. Tourists who want to keep up with their schedules as well as entertainment require shorter and therefore less authentic activities. Thus, the entertainment loses its cultural value. Cultural villages are large hotels giving floor shows may manipulate authentic host traditions and events to conform to the time schedules and tastes of tourists. This effort to turn folklore, religious or secular ceremonies, and artistic productions to material advantage leads to commercialism, thus prostituting the values of the local residents. The architectural designs of most international hotels are of Western styles and often exhibit little knowledge and appreciation of the social traditions of the local inhabitants. So here are some of the control measures that may be adopted to reduce the negative impact of tourism and hospitality on culture. First is develop programs which enhance tourism and hospitality's contribution to intercultural communication and interaction, such as matching tourist types with destination characteristics and designing programs for the interaction of local residents and guests, promoting goodwill ambassador tourist education, and incorporate local indigenous features within Western-style structures, such as decorating hotel interiors with local paintings, murals, and sculpture, and encouraging porters, maids, and waiters to dress in native costumes. Now let's move on to the environmental impact of tourism and hospitality. The history of tourism and hospitality closely shows that the environment has contributed to the birth and progress of tourism and hospitality. The term environment connotes both human and physical characteristics. Speakers and writers often refer to it as human environment, physical environment, or a combination of both. A term that describes the human and physical characteristics of an area is pre-existing forms. It is expected that some change in pre-existing forms will be necessary to accommodate mass tourism. However, tourism and hospitality can either be carefully controlled by the government to maximize economic and employment opportunities while reducing its social, cultural, and physical impact, or it can be changed as to enhance the physical environment and make it more attractive to both the guests and local residents. An analysis of the positive and negative aspects of tourism and hospitality indicates a need to encourage wise resources management, particularly of water and energy, and the problems of noise and pollution, as well as the problem of garbage and fire hazards which may arise from tourist activities. The environmental benefits and negative impacts of tourism and hospitality need to be recognized. Tourism and hospitality has created environmental awareness in two ways. First, contact with scenic areas has raised man's awareness of the earth's beauty and made it easier for him to see and enjoy it with minimum damage, and environmental awareness has been heightened by mass tourism, which caused direct and indirect destruction. In developed countries, several national parks and monuments have been created to preserve the natural, cultural, and recreational resources of the land for the enjoyment, appreciation, and education of present and future generations. The development of parks was intended to open up areas for viewing as well as to control the flow of traffic within the park. Tourism and hospitality has provided reasons for the preservation of historical buildings and the creation of museums. At present, many developing nations are realizing that their monuments mean tourists and income. Thus, desire to preserve their national monuments have increased. In developed countries, unspoiled natural attractions are becoming more and more rare. Hence, people travel to developing nations where nature is still unspoiled or where the remains of ancient civilizations are located. Developing nations realize that their historical sites or traditional towns and neighborhoods untouched by progress are economic assets. Lighthouses, harbors, and fishing piers are ideal tourist attractions. Tourism and hospitality has created appreciation of the environment by bringing scenic attractions to the attention of the public. In Switzerland, for example, mountain sports and vacations, both in winter and summer, have mushroomed as a result of rapid tourist growth. So here are the positive environmental impact of tourism and hospitality. Conservation and preservation of the environment not only benefit the local area, but also determine the future of tourism and hospitality. First, the local residents benefit from the preservation. Second, tourism and hospitality, for as long as it draws tourists, will continue to be a socio-economic and cultural asset. The aim of the National Park Service with the inclusion of conservation is much broader now than it was in the past. The national parks in East Africa, Kenya, and Tanzania were founded to protect wildlife. In some places, bird sanctuary is one of the major attractions for tourists who want to seek a change from their sun, sea, and sand experiences. Natural trails and bird watching areas have been established to help the visitors enjoy the area and to maintain the quality of the environment. So Gunn, cited by Vallin in 1995, gave the following factors which led to the conservation movement. There was a social concern to which the park movement owes its beginnings. The growth of industry and commerce and their associated ills stimulated the demand for the parks and open space. The provision for public lands was seen as an antidote to the immoral values of urban society and as an escape from the routine work and urban living. Second, there was an emphasis on the efficiency of resources being used, particularly on non-renewable resources. Early expectations stressed maximum utilization, but with a minimum of environmental degradation. Third, conservation also incorporated aesthetic enhancement. This is particularly significant as one major tourist activity is sightseeing, which depends heavily on the qualities of the natural environment. And lastly, protecting the natural environment from irresponsible human manipulation. So Matheson and Wall, cited by Landberg in 1995, identified 4 ways in which tourism and hospitality has been important to conservation. So these are stimulating the rehabilitation of existing historic sites, buildings, and monuments, stimulating the transformation of old buildings and locations into new tourist facilities, creating the impetus for the conservation of natural resources, and bringing about the introduction of administrative and planning controls necessary to maintain the quality of the environment to ensure a satisfying and rewarding experience for the tourists. It can be concluded that tourism and hospitality provides incentives that the economic means and incentives for the conservation and preservation of natural and historic sites. Many monuments, historic houses, villages, and old churches cannot be maintained without the tourist income. So next is development of attractions. Several countries around the world are identifying areas which have the potential to attract tourists. In the Caribbean island of St. Croix, the U.S. National Park Service has established and developed an underwater national park. This unique site attracts snorkelers and those interested in corals. It helps preserve the area and creates an awareness of the character of the coral reefs and the sea floor. High mountain areas have been developed. A very good example is Jungfrau in Switzerland, which boasts of having the highest railway in Europe. Other examples are the Banawe Rice Terraces and Baguio City in the Philippines. So the benefits of development are historic preservation and resident benefits. The first one is historic preservation. Many historical sites in both urban and rural areas have been preserved to attract tourists. Examples are Intramuros or World City in the Philippines, Jamestown and Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, USA, Mount Saint Michel in France, and the Plymouth Plantation in Massachusetts, USA. This restoration and rejuvenation process is occurring throughout the world and serves as major characteristics of an area intended to impress tourists. The second one is resident benefits. Tourism and hospitality benefits the local residents in a number of ways. The first benefit is that the results of conservation and preservation can be enjoyed by the local community as well as by the tourists. The creation of national parks and monuments provides quick access to a variety of nature's wonders and outdoor activities to both local residents and visitors. Another benefit which results from tourism and hospitality development can be seen in coastal areas. The development of a coastal resort allows free access to tourists and local residents. Exceeding the carrying capacity and saturation levels of an area will negatively affect that area. The term carrying capacity is the degree of development a certain area can take without having detrimental effects on the environment. If the tourist development becomes saturated, the very attractions which draw visitors to a place may be destroyed, causing the decline in quality and popularity of a certain tourist destination. The saturation levels and the types of environment between developed and developing countries are different. Some environments with significant differences in their saturation levels are wilderness, rural, coastal, mountain, urban, and the developed versus the developing areas. The difference between developed and developing areas lies in the cultural dissimilarities and the measure of control used to handle the development. In developing countries, there is a lack of control measures because of cultural differences, lack of technical skills, and lack of financial resources needed to implement plans. So here are the negative environmental impact of tourism and hospitality, environmental conflicts, geographical conflicts, and resident conflicts. So first is environmental conflicts. Some of the problems affecting the quality of the environment are destruction of the vegetation, pollution in the form of air, water, noise, and visual, and the destruction of wildlife. The destruction of the vegetation occurs because of the large number of tourists who trample on the vegetation. In many parks, campers have cut branches of trees and completely cut down small trees. In areas such as ocean fronts and islands, many visitors going to and from the area destroy the vegetation cover, thus changing the natural habitats for birds and animals, and in some cases, even changing the temperature of the area. Sometimes, the loss of vegetation leads to soil erosion and further debasement of the environment. Air pollution results from the gas fumes emitted by automobiles, taxis, buses, aircrafts, and factories. Areas with large numbers of vehicles usually suffer from air pollution. Water pollution is the result of the discharge of untreated waste from resorts or boats into seas, rivers, lakes, and springs. The lack of an effective sewage system in some areas has led to the widespread pollution of the inshore waters, making fish consumption inadvisable and swimming unhealthy. Moreover, such diseases as cholera, typhoid, viral hepatitis, and dysentery are caused by seafood from polluted waters. Noise pollution is associated with traffic congestion on land and on air. Many recreational vehicles such as motorcycles and motorboats and aircrafts cause a lot of noise. Visual pollution is resulted from the buildings that are not properly planned on where to put them without following the zoning. Problems associated with wildlife results from killing of animals such as birds and disruption of the normal habits of feeding and breeding. A very good example is the killing of elephants for tusks, zebras for hides, antelopes for their heads, lion claws for necklaces, monkeys for skin throw rugs, gazelles for hoof key rings, and the like. The prevalence of many tourists in an area changes the breeding habits and living patterns of much of the wildlife. The animals are forced to move to a less traditional habitat. Next is geographical conflicts. Tourism and hospitality affects geological formations. Some tourists collect minerals, rocks, fossils, and corals from tourist attractions. Others also destroy natural formations by vandalizing. Lastly is resident conflicts. A number of conflicts frequently occur between residents and tourists or tourism developers. In cities, hotels are built at the expense of residential accommodations. The increasing value of land often forces residents to move away from the area. Hotel development also brings traffic congestion and air pollution. In fishing and hunting areas, the increasing demand creates problems for local fishermen and hunters who now compete with tourists as well as with each other. Conflict between tourists and the local residents may also arise because of damage to the area brought by littering, vandalism, and traffic congestion. In rural areas, the damage to crops, farm buildings, and livestock are common complaints of farmers, together with the increasing value of lands, competition for labor, and land erosion. So, two measures which will reduce the negative impact of tourism and hospitality have been identified, thus creating a quality environment for both residents and tourists. First, the general protective measures, and second, regulation and control of tourist development. The protective measures are designed to safeguard the various aspects of the environment, endangered animals and plants, beaches and forests through the creation of national parks and wilderness areas. The man-made environment is included in the conservation and restoration of historical or archaeological monuments, valuable buildings, and neighborhoods. These measures have two objectives: to protect the environment and to maintain its attractiveness as a tourist destination. Regulation and control refers to zoning and land use and planning specifications on the facilities being built as to height, appearance, open space, and overall design, among other things. These are rapidly done in some countries like Switzerland, where builders must follow certain architectural styles before permission is given for development. These are done to prevent unattractive tourist development. So that ends our discussion for this topic. Any questions, you may ask it to your teacher. See you!